Hey guys, I'm Dave and welcome to the Trull Gallery. Today, we're going to make a passive speaker from my cell phone. First of all, I'd like to apologize for the extended wait between videos. Between the holidays and a large project that got delayed because my client still doesn't have a floor in her house, things got a bit out of whack. Okay, let's talk about today's project. We have several Bluetooth speakers that we can use with our cell phones, so why do I need a passive speaker? Well, Margaret and I facilitate a weekly meditation group, and I like to have a little soft music playing in the background. The problem is sometimes we forget to charge the speaker, and it starts to beep at us mid-meditation, and that tends to mess with your peace. So I figured, why not try to make a passive speaker that never needs charging and won't bark at us while we're meditating? I have no idea if this will work, but I'm willing to give it a shot.
I couldn't find any plans I liked online, but I picked up a few ideas. I started with a general idea for a size, 8 inches wide, 3 inches deep, and 2 inches tall. I began with a 3D drawing in SketchUp. I planned to build it from walnut and maple for a bit of visual interest. The front will have a smooth curve, and the center maple layer will have a cutout for the sound to travel out from the phone. I left out the upper front piece of walnut, partly for clarity and partly because drawing matching curves in SketchUp is hard. To transfer the drawing to a pattern, I cut a blank of 1/2-inch plywood to 8x3. I marked the center of the 8-inch side and a mark on either end 1 inch up from the front. Then I used a plastic rule with a string to make a drawing bow. I adjusted the tension until the bow could just touch all 3 of my layout marks, and then traced the arc onto the pattern. On a second blank, I retraced my arc, then added the layout lines for the sound channel. I kept those curves as wide as possible in the hopes that the sound would flow smoothly into the opening. Both were cut out at the bandsaw and sanded smooth. I grabbed a couple of pieces of scrap for this build. 2 pieces of walnut and 1 of maple. One of the walnut pieces was a bit too thin, so I cut it in half and face glued the 2 pieces together, and hoping that the seam will fade into the grain once everything is complete. The first step was to rough cut the pieces the size of the table saw. I started with the upper front walnut piece that will be 1 5/8 by 1 inch. Then the base that'll be 3 inches by 1/2 inch, and then the upper back piece at 1 by 3/4. Next were the maple pieces at 3 by 1/2, and what'll be the 2 center pieces at 1 by 5/8. Everything was still long at this point, so I could feed them through the planer. I started with the 3 pieces that are 1 inch thick and brought them to size. Next, the 2 pieces that'll be 1/2 inch thick. The key here is to flip the stock after every pass, so I take off the same amount from each face. This minimizes the chances for cups or twists in the stock later. And if you're wondering why I'm not using my dust collector, well, I've got that large project in the shop and my hose won't reach where I'm working. The other pieces were cleaned up the same way. With the pieces cut to size, or a bit over, it was time to take them to the bandsaw and remove the waste, at least on the first 2 pieces. I started with the center maple piece and cut just outside the line that I'd traced from the pattern. The closer I get to the line, the less stress I'll put on my route a bit in the next step. The bottom walnut piece was cut as well, but this just gets the front curve. You can see that I almost forgot to make these cuts as I'd already put the double stick tape down. Luckily, I caught it in time. At the router table, I chucked up my 1/4 inch spiral flush trim bit and used that double stick tape to hold the pattern to the first 2 pieces. I ran all 4 sides on the walnut just to make sure that everything would line up later. The center maple piece was cut in the same way, but I took a little more time to clean out that sound chamber. Before going any further, I decided to sand the inside of the sound chamber. I cleaned it up with the smallest drum sander I have. This did a nice job, but I followed that with some hand sanding since getting in here after assembly would be next to impossible. I knew trying to glue everything up at once would be a nightmare, so I decided to work 2 pieces at a time. I lightly traced the sound chamber onto the walnut so that when I added the glue I could steer clear of that area. Again, cleaning that up after glue up would not be fun. Once the glue was spread, I set the 2 pieces together and tacked them in place with a few 23 gauge pins. They held things in place but didn't offer a lot of clamping strength, so I added a few clamps until the glue dried. The top layer was also glued in place 1 piece at a time. I started with the back piece, added some glue, and clamped it in place. After wiping away any squeeze out, it was set aside to dry. Before gluing in the 2 pieces that make up the center of the top, I cut them a hair long at the miter saw. With pieces this small, I think it's important to let the blade come to a complete stop before moving it out of the way. To ensure that I got the maple in the right locations, I marked the center of the back piece and a spacer, and then clamped the spacer in place. I used packing tape on the edges so the glue wouldn't stick to it. Then the 2 bits of maple were glued and clamped into place, first clamping top to bottom and then front to back to ensure a good bond. I didn't use too much pressure on the C-clamps so it wouldn't dent the back. Then I let that dry as well. The last piece to go on was the top front. I added glue to the maple pieces, making sure to stay clear of that open area. Again, I don't want to have to get in there and clean up any squeeze out. Then it was clamped like before and set aside to dry. I left that front piece square to make clamping easier. Now I could trim off the excess stock starting at the bandsaw. I carefully cut just beyond the first 2 layers. At the miter saw, I trimmed the ends flush. Since the overall length of the piece isn't critical, I cut just a hair off the bottom, cleaning up the middle and top layers. First one side, and then the other. To clean up the top curve, I went back to the router table. My fancy flush trim bit was about 1/8 of an inch too short, so I switched over to a long straight trim bit. The bearing was just able to ride along the top of the curve while cutting the top front piece. I got some minor tear out at the beginning, but that should sand out. And speaking of sanding, it's time to clean this thing up. I started with 120 grit paper on my random orbit sander and worked my way through 220 grit. Considering how many glue lines and joints this has, it only took about 10 minutes total until everything looked just right. The final step was to ease the corners, and I did that with some 220 grit paper by hand. A few swipes on every edge, and the piece maintains a crisp look, but it's not sharp to the touch. I've been watching a lot of people switch to hard oil finishes, and I thought I'd give it a shot. A small project like this is a perfect test piece for a new finish, especially since I'll be keeping it. The brand I use is a 2-part finish that's mixed 3-to-1. I thought these oral syringes would be a great way to measure accurately, but the hardener is really thick. It took some doing to get it into the syringe. Once I got both parts in the cup, I mixed it thoroughly and it was time to apply. I meant to wear gloves, but I forgot. I started with an acid brush to get into the openings, then I switched over to a white abrasive pad to work the finish into the wood. Once everything was coated, I let it dry for about 5 minutes. I came back, with gloves this time, and wiped off all the excess finish. Like many of these finishes, this is a 1-coat process. While the instructions are a little vague, I can step on the finish in 24 hours. I suppose that goes for touching as well. I did give it a quick buffing the next day. Now there's nothing left to do but see if this works the way I hope.
This was a quick and easy project, and it only used a few pieces of scrap wood. I got to try out a new finish, and In the end, everything looks great, and it sounds good too. At least now we don't have to worry about making that extra noise during meditation. Your thoughts about this video? Was there something I could have done different, easier, smarter, safer? Drop them in the comments below. I'd also love to hear if you need a gadget like this in your life. As usual, I'll add links to some of the tools and materials that I used in this video and some of the stuff I use here in the shop on a regular basis. Should you happen to need one of those things and purchase it through the links, it does help keep the channel going. If you enjoyed this video, maybe give us a thumbs up and share it with friends. If you haven't already, maybe it's time to hit that subscribe button and a little bell so you get notified each time I put out a new video. Okay, this time I think I know what's coming up next, but you never know, so let's hold off on that. So until then, have a great day, stay safe, and we'll see you soon.